Demon Hunters 4 Premonition, written by Avril Sabine. Dedication. For my oldest son. Thanks for all the chocolate cakes and chocolate chip biscuits while I was writing this book. And for coming up with cricket. Book description. Emily Hunter has had the same dream every night for the past 6 months, one that made her quit being a demon hunter. It's a nightmare she wishes never to have again. When she finally dreams of something else, it doesn't help, only has her fearing for her sanity and her life. To survive, she needs to face all she's tried to avoid. If she fails, it'll mean not only her life is over, but also the life of a boy from her dreams. She knows only too well that when demons are involved, nightmares can come true. Chapter 1. Emily struggled to escape the dream. She knew it had to be one, it was the only time she saw her parents. Night after night she watched them walk down the same corridor. Watched them come ever closer to the closed door at the far end, the beam of light from her father's torch shining on the warped timber, a sword in his other hand. Beside him her mother held her bow, an arrow aimed at the closed door that continued to come closer. She wanted to scream at them to run. Tell them not to open the door. She should have told them the first time. Should have rung them when she dragged herself from sleep that first night, to stare at the glowing numbers of her alarm clock. 2:45 a.m. Those numbers would be forever inscribed in her mind. As was the scene she saw each time the door swung open. The dream vanished, replaced by a scruffy brown dog looking up at her. Emily stared down at him. This had never happened before. She was always forced to see the dream through to the end. To eventually wake with tears streaming down her cheeks, an ache in her chest, and a hollow feeling she didn't know what to do with. She wasn't sure if she should be relieved or worried to see the dog. She guessed it was an Australian Terrier cross, taller than a terrier at around 45 centimeters, but with the typical look of one, including the slightly darker markings down his back and around his muzzle. She had no idea why he'd invaded her dream. He took a couple of steps towards her, whining when she continued to look at him. Catching a glimpse of a tag on his collar, she bent down to read the name. Before she could touch the dog, a large cricket appeared in its place, staring at her for a second before it jumped away. She wanted to wake up. Unlike her usual dream, there were no demons and no blood. Only darkness and a bad feeling. She peered into the darkness but could see nothing. She dreaded following. Dreaded what she'd find, but couldn't fight the urge to step into the dark. She ran into a letterbox that loomed up out of the darkness, the area around her becoming a foggy gray. Stepping back from the metal letterbox that was on a lean, she ran her fingers over the raised numbers on the front. 78. What did it mean? Or did it mean nothing? Looking past the letterbox, the dread she'd been feeling increased. She wanted to wake up. Knowing she was dreaming should make it easier to wake. It didn't. She had 6 months of nightmare-filled nights to prove it. Even ordering herself to wake up didn't help. She was as trapped as her parents had been. Stepping around the letterbox, she kept moving forward. The darkness receded with each step, the area around her full of murky shadows. Her right hand tightened into a fist, and she wished she had her bow. It appeared in her hand, and she stared down at it, reaching for an arrow out of the quiver that was now on her back. It didn't make her feel any better. Only waking would do that. A house loomed out of the darkness ahead of her, no lights showing at the windows. Hearing a whining sound, she walked silently around to the back of the house. She stopped when she saw the dog stood on his back legs to scratch at a window ledge. She tried to fight it, but couldn't prevent herself from moving forward to peer in the window. Behind her she could hear the ticking of a clock, but when she glanced over her shoulder there was only darkness. She had a feeling time was running out. But she didn't know who for. Herself? The dog? Someone else? Not her parents, their time had already run out. 6 months ago on a trip to Brisbane. The window came closer. Would it be like the room when her father had opened the door? Was this only another angle of the same dream? If so, why the dog? Lowering the bow, she shut her eyes as she felt herself lean forward. The glass of the window was cold against her face, but she refused to look. Doubted she could cope with any more gory details. Falling asleep was difficult enough these days, without adding anything else to keep her from it. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. The familiar words caused her to open her eyes and she stared into the room, trying to place the quote. Shock held her in place when she wanted to run. She dreaded to find out what would happen next. Her legs wouldn't obey and she met the gaze of a boy around her age, chained to a solid timber bed. He stretched out a hand to her, his brown eyes pleading with her to help. She shook her head. She couldn't help him. She hadn't been able to help her parents. But she wanted to help him. Something about him had her feeling as if she knew him or should know him. Closing her eyes, she immediately opened them, unable to face the sight of the blood she regularly saw in the darkness of her mind. She'd been seeing it ever since that first nightmare. The one that had come true. The boy was gone, flames leaping across the bed he'd been chained to. She dropped the arrow, her hand covering her mouth to hold in the scream that threatened to escape at the sight of the flames. She took a step back. Had he been burned alive? Turning, she ran, the dog appearing at her side, footsteps behind her. She didn't look. Didn't want to know what followed. A street sign came out of the darkness and she stumbled, trying to avoid it. Grabbing hold of the post, she looked up, the name seared into her mind along with the number she'd seen earlier. Beyond the sign she saw the moon, a narrow crescent in the sky. All hope abandon, ye who enter here. Hearing the words spoken behind her, she spun to see the boy, realizing what this and the earlier quote were from. Dante. He reached for her, wearing no shirt and blood smeared across his chest from shallow cuts. Before he could make contact, she woke, gasping for breath, sitting up to swing her legs to the floor, nausea making her stomach churn. She reached for the bedside lamp, her gaze scanning the room the moment it was filled with light. She was safe. Nothing was in the room. Yet she couldn't resist sliding her fingers between the mattress and the bed base. A touch of relief started to fill her when she felt the dagger. Withdrawing her hand, she absently rubbed at her demon mark. It was a narrow black line with a hint of red in it, that started at the pulse point in the middle of her wrist, and traveled to the outside, wrapping around once. It was part of her skin, not a tattoo as many people assumed, and was gained from dealing with demons. It burned or itched when demons were in the area, depending on the power of the demon, but now it was fine. The only demons were the ones in her nightmare. Ones that had plagued her every night. Her gaze stopped on the alarm clock. 2:45 a.m. Closing her eyes, she clutched the edge of the bed, trying to slow her breathing. It didn't help. She wanted to scream or throw up. Instead, she opened her eyes, slowly rose to her feet and crossed the room. Reminding herself to remain calm, she rested her head on the bedroom door for a moment, grounding herself in reality. It had only been a dream. Images of her parents' funeral came to her. Some nightmares did come true. Pain arrowed through her and she swung the door open, her jaw clenched tight as she fought against it. She forced all thoughts from her mind, trying to focus on her surroundings. The rest of the house was silent, and she crept along the hallway. Her uncles were probably in bed. They weren't really her uncles. They were her grandfather's nephews. But when you had a large extended family like hers, it often became confusing keeping track of how everyone was related. It was easier to simplify things. Reaching the guest bathroom, she turned on the light and made her way to the vanity. She gripped the edge of the sink for a moment before turning on the tap and splashing water on her face. It didn't help. She hadn't expected to dispel the feelings her dream had left her with that easily. But it had been worth a try. She stared at herself in the mirror, trying to figure out if the shadows under her hazel eyes were worse or if it was from the harsh bathroom light. She feared they were worse. But what could she expect when her sleep was continually broken by nightmares? Pushing dark honey-colored hair away from her face, she turned her back on the mirror. She couldn't keep this up. Couldn't continue to go night after night with very little sleep. Not that she had any idea what she could do to change things. Nothing she'd tried so far had worked. Striding from the bathroom, she headed outside, stopping on the veranda that went the perimeter of the house. The cool night air washed over her, making it difficult to believe how hot it had been yesterday. Although she guessed she shouldn't complain. January in the northern outskirts of Brisbane was far cooler than where she lived in Mackay. Hearing footsteps, she spun, her body tense to fight. Seeing it was Leo, she tried to relax, but her heart continued to race and she remained alert, waiting for an attack that wasn't coming. "Did I wake you?" She tried to be quiet. Leo shrugged. "I'm a light sleeper. Those brothers of mine keep me awake most of the night with their snoring." "Was it Adam and Saul's snoring that woke you?" He was in his early 40s, was both tall and broad, and his beard had a touch of grey in amongst the brown. His head was shaved, and creases radiated out from his blue eyes when he smiled. She tried to return his smile but wasn't sure how successful she was. Her gaze was drawn to the flannelette shirt he wore with faded denim jeans. She was tempted to ask him if he slept in a flannelette shirt, as well as wearing one every day. She searched around for something to say. "I've nearly finished cataloguing another book for Gran." She'd arrived 6 days ago for her cousin Charlotte's wedding, and had used helping to catalogue the family's extensive library on demons as an excuse not to return home. She'd hoped the change of scenery would help with the nightmares. It looked like she was wrong. She was beginning to fear nothing would, and she'd be tormented by them for years. Leo tucked his hands into his pockets. "Uncle Tim and Aunt Kathy rang while you were taking a walk earlier. I didn't expect you to be gone so long. I told them I'd get you to ring when you returned. They rang a second time." She'd been trying to avoid all of them. Or more accurately, the looks they gave her. The ones that asked, without words, if she was okay. Did Granddad and Grandma say what they wanted? "To see how you are. They miss you. I think they're wondering when you're going home. Or if you are." She looked away from him, noticing the moon. It reminded her of the one in her dream. A crescent that was a little thinner than the one she dreamt of. A shiver went through her as she tried to stop images from the dream invading her mind. "Is that your way of saying I've overstayed my welcome?" She looked over her shoulder at him, her head tilted slightly to the side, away from her shoulder, as she tried to figure out his expression. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like, Emily." The creases around his eyes disappeared and his voice was soft. With a slight nod, she returned her gaze to the moon. What had her dream meant? She didn't want to be like Gran. Didn't want to dream of the future. The only time she had, and she still wasn't completely certain if it had been a premonition, was when her parents had died. She'd had plenty of nightmares before and none of them had come true. Not a single one. She'd planned to ask Gran about her dream after the wedding, but with everything that happened that day, she hadn't been able to bring herself to speak to her about it. "You do know we're here if you ever want to talk about anything. Anything at all." Continuing to watch the moon, she nodded. She hadn't been able to tell anyone. She didn't know which would be worse. Fearing for her sanity or having premonitions. If it was the latter, then she'd let her parents die. She'd had the chance to save them but had done nothing about it, thinking it had only been a bad dream. She didn't know if she could live with that. Did you want something to help you sleep? They always offer warm milk in the movies. This time her smile came easily. She faced Leo. Maybe in movies from your generation. In mine, they offer alcohol. Chuckling, Leo shook his head. That's not going to happen. Not until you're 18. Ask me again in October. She hadn't expected him to agree. Yawning, she covered her mouth. I might head back to bed. If she was lucky, she'd manage to fall into a dreamless sleep. You let me know if you need anything. He clapped her on the back. She staggered forward slightly even though she'd been expecting it, and had braced herself. Okay. Leaving Leo on the veranda, she returned to her room. Again she yawned and, taking it as a positive sign, dropped onto the bed. Turning out the light, she lay in the dark, waiting for sleep to arrive. It didn't. It wasn't until the darkness of the room became gray that she fell asleep. She guessed it wasn't long after she'd fallen asleep that her usual dream started, and she was forced to relive her parents' last night all over again. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't wake. Guilt washed over her as she watched her parents come closer to the door and did nothing to stop them. Even in her dream she couldn't warn them. It wasn't until the multitude of demons in the room had slaughtered her parents, blood staining the walls and floor, that she was able to wake.